Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm staring at the one. There we go. Like I encouraged you to talk to people next to you earlier, hopefully everyone in this room is kind of obsessed with transportation and kind of obsessed with data, although probably on a range of kinda to a lot. You're on the a lot side. Can I get a sense? We've got all of our panelists are in the front row. I'm going to ask them to turn around and look at the answers. Raise your hand if you live in Boston. You're a Boston resident. Ooh, raise your hand if you work in Boston. You're like committed to the city by, great. Raise your hand if you work in a for-profit world. Welcome. Non-profit world. Great. Public sector. Lots of public sector. And academia, wherever that falls in the scheme of things. Okay. So we have a sense of who's in the audience. You have not a lot of information about the great panelists that you're hearing from today in the program, but you have a lot of information about the research they're presenting, so hopefully you're already excited about what they're talking about. Each of them is going to come up and present from here, and then they'll join the front row. The one note that's not in your program is that it looks like the MBTA is being presented by Laurel and Anna, who are here and are presenting, but we also have some of the data finalists who submitted to their data competition, so you'll actually be hearing from them as well, and I'll let them introduce themselves when they come up. So our first presenter today is Maggie Superchurch, the VP at the Conservation Law Foundation, who's going to start us off.
Thank you. It's great to see everyone. Among the many things I love about this gathering, I feel like I always go to other parts of the country and meet fabulous people from Boston doing interesting work on data. So to be here talking to people who are doing all this kind of work and thinking about how we all collaborate and learn from each other is super exciting. I would also like to introduce my colleague Andrew Cedar. Wave hello in the back. Andrew has recently joined our team as a senior associate for research and metrics and is thinking about the work that I'm going to talk about, but also a related and really exciting research project that I won't have time to do justice to today, but just to say there's a whole research and evaluation effort alongside the investment fund that we created. So I'm going to take you on a kind of quick spin through what has been a multi-year journey, building an investment fund that's really aimed at trying to drive equitable development around transit hubs, not just in Boston, but in the region, and tell you a little bit about how we got there and who's involved. So since we're doing quick show of hands, who's familiar with Conservation Law Foundation in the room? Awesome. Okay, how many people know that Conservation Law Foundation has a markets team that doesn't just do litigation? Okay, good. So I'm introducing the markets team at the Conservation Law Foundation. CLF does a variety of things, best known for a lot of the legal advocacy and policy work around things like healthy communities, clean water, cleanup of toxic sites, but there's also an important piece around both science and markets. And so that's really thinking about how we use data, how we use research, how we use evidence to drive policy and decision making, but also, in the case of the work that I'm involved with, how we use it to think about market solutions that provide another tool and another set of opportunities to address some of the same challenges. So founded in '66, our mission is to protect New England's environment for the benefit of all people. We have program offices in most New England states, and our vision really is a healthy, thriving New England for generations to come. So that's obviously a sweeping mission, but that really lands in some particular areas through the fund that I'm going to talk about today. I also want to introduce a couple of our partners who we've worked very closely with on this and other initiatives. The Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation, which is one of the largest community development financial institutions in the region. MHIC has provided millions of dollars in tax credit financing, commercial lending, residential lending, really grew out of an effort by the banks to try to think about how to drive more lending to neighborhoods that had been systematically disinvested in, kind of redlining, post-redlining era, and also importantly, how to drive resources for development to minority and local contractors who often were left out of those opportunities. So since that time, MHIC's grown, does a lot of work in a number of different areas related to affordable housing, commercial facilities, community development more broadly. MAPC, you all I think in this room probably know, having heard this morning's introduction, has been another terrific partner of ours. And the two people that we've worked closely with on this are Kathy McGilvray from MHIC, who unfortunately couldn't be here this morning, and Barry Keppard, who leads the public health team at MAPC, who I think was planning to be here, but I don't see him. Oh, There you are. Hi, Barry. All right, awesome. So I was just saying to a fellow panelist this morning that I think one of the great privileges of being in the city is there's so much talent, and MHEC and MAPC represent an incredible set of talent that we've been able to partner with to do something that might be harder to do in other places, and there's often a lot of envy for the number of partners we have with the kind of expertise we have here. So although I am speaking, I want Barry and Andrew and others to jump in, and please be available to answer questions as well. So what is HNEF? What's this fund that I'm talking about? So this is something that we launched about 5 years ago with our partners. It's a real estate private equity fund, which is important because it's not providing loans, it's actually providing equity investments, which we understood to be a need for this type of development based on a lot of work that MAPC and others had done. And the challenge or the conundrum was there's a strong desire for locating equitable development, both housing and jobs, in and around transit facilities for all kinds of reasons: environmental benefits, public health benefits, quality of life benefits, job access. But it turns out it's often hard to do that for a variety of reasons, and one of those is that financing can often be hard to secure in a lot of the neighborhoods where we would most want to see that investment happen. So you end up either waiting for years to accumulate subsidies and tax credits, finding it difficult to secure enough conventional debt, neighborhoods that are perceived to be too risky, or where the traditional private equity returns are too low. But we know that those are places in many instances that really need and want, and have affirmatively said we're seeking new development, but we're having a hard time securing financing. So the goal really is stable, mixed income, mixed use neighborhoods near transit, which sounds straightforward, turns out is very difficult to do in practice, and increasingly not what we're seeing as we look across the region. So that's kind of the broad context. This is a diagram we created early on to show that unlike 30 years ago when development was moving out of cities and there was a push to just move everyone around on highways, there's a move back to cities, right? Big companies want to be in cities. Increasingly, people looking for housing want to be in cities. So we see a kind of alignment between the type of development that produces a lot of these benefits and where the market is going. So that's a great opportunity, but also a challenge as we think about making sure that kind of equity and the ability to be in these neighborhoods, no matter who you are, remains front and center. So just to say briefly, I think I touched on this, MAPC's Metro Future Plan identified some targets for transit-oriented development across the region using a station area typology. 2012 study found that these station areas broadly, and this is the region, I see Tim there, so Tim, you can jump in if I'm misrepresenting this at all. So good so far. But there was this incredible mismatch. I actually remember Tim presenting this slide that said, here's what we've done over the past 10 years, and here's what it will look like if sort of business as usual continues. And it was nowhere close to reaching these targets. So that was a real call to action. And as I mentioned, this issue of access to patient equity is a real challenge. A couple of other pieces of context, which I think I alluded to. We're seeing increased income inequality and income segregation. So we have very high income neighborhoods, lower income neighborhoods. Higher income neighborhoods tend to be more stable, but very difficult to access. Lower income neighborhoods, very unstable, a lot of churn, people moving in and out, a lot of displacement. So the question is, how do we sort of think about balancing that scale and not moving in a direction that creates increasing concentrations of poverty in the region? Many of you probably saw the the study that found income inequality was #1 in Boston compared to a number of other regions. So something we want to be thinking hard about. So I think I alluded to this, but the fund is really set up to provide real economic return for investors, but at a much lower rate than a traditional private equity fund would do, with significant risk mitigation coming from both public and philanthropic investors. And we're trying to invest in places that other investors won't go. So we're making something happen that otherwise couldn't happen or wouldn't happen in the market. The other piece that's really important, and really that we spent a lot of time thinking about, and that MAPC and others really helped us understand more deeply, was the connection between this type of development and health outcomes. So this idea that your zip code matters more than your genetic code for health is something that I think now we have kind of understood deeply enough that it seems second nature, but it is really startling when you look at the data and understand how much of what drives how long and how well we live is not genetic or clinical, but really about all the experiences of daily life and the choices that we have or the choices that we don't have. So this is the slide that sort of has always gotten attention when we make a pitch to investors, that we could see differences in life expectancy of more than 30 years in 2 neighborhoods either side of the world's leading medical center. And so clearly it's not just access to health services, particularly in Massachusetts, where we've had closer to universal coverage longer. I think those numbers may have moved a little bit since then, but that's still a pretty shocking number and something that we should be thinking hard about how to address. So this is really where MAPC and the Mass Department of Public Health came in. We understood that there were these incredible disparities. We understood health was driven by conditions in place. Our question was, if we're building a fund and screening investments and trying to monitor impact, what do we look at? There are a lot of features that matter. There's housing, there's parks, there's safety, there's streets, all kinds of things going on. And so Barry and his team and Tim and others helped us put together a health impact assessment that really brought that question to ground. And this is the sort of headline or sort of the synopsis of what is a much longer and really terrific study that looked at how important things like walkability, safety, food access, economic opportunity are, in addition to some of the more traditional measures that you would think about. And so that helped us really think about how to rate projects, essentially. So we built a scorecard that uses about 50 different measures, some qualitative, some quantitative. Some of that data comes from MAPC, some of it we commission as primary data using a street-level audit tool, and some of it comes from state health data. And then that allows us to score projects, and on that basis, they either go to investment committee or they don't. So it carries the same weight as the financial underwriting, which is really important. I'm just showing you a couple of snapshots of projects that the fund has invested in and the kind of summary of the scoring for those projects. We've committed 17 million of the 22 million we raised. These are 2 of the projects that received investments, Treadmark, which is right by the Ashmont T station, and Bartlett Station in Dudley Square. So I'm happy to say more about any piece of this, but I think the point here really is that the ability to use data and tie it to an investment vehicle to solve a real problem that itself is grounded in data about the region and kind of where the gaps are has been exciting, and we've learned a lot, and I've really appreciated working with our partners. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to flip through the disclaimer because I showed you an investment slide, did that, and that's my contact info. Thank you.
Next up, we have Suzie Birdsell from Nelson Nygaard.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here today. I am presenting today on a project that the MBTA and Nelson Nygaard, which, if you don't know, is a sustainable transportation consulting firm, are teaming up on to investigate bus service in the Boston region. It's called the Better Bus Project. One of the main goals is to identify gaps, major gaps in the service, compare the current network and the quality of service against the service delivery policy, which looks at things like on-time performance, which if you ride buses in Boston, you know can be an issue, how the span of service, how late does service go, different things like that. And then also the part I'm focusing on, which is an in-depth look at the market and the demand for bus service. And, you know, kind of 30,000 feet in the air, where are the people, where are the jobs, where are transit-dependent populations, where are people going in general? And then also part of it is looking at a very thorough investigation of each route individually and really getting into the nitty-gritty. But as I said, I am mostly focusing on looking the really, really high-level stuff. And so when we think about demand for transit, we always start with population density. It's not only where are a lot of people, where are they, but also where are the dense populations and where do they cluster? Because we, in order to support high amounts of transit, we need people in, you know, apartment buildings, walkable neighborhoods, things like that. So as most of us know, the dense parts of Boston are downtown, Back Bay, East Boston, South Boston. Increasingly, Everett and Chelsea and Kendall have seen, have historically been dense, but also have seen significant population growth over the last several years. Along with population density, what's really important when thinking about transit is who's more likely to ride transit, what socioeconomic groups. And I have conducted this analysis all over the country, looking at taking census data, looking at journey to work, and seeing who is less and more likely than the mean to ride transit. And as you can see, white, non-Hispanic, 80% of the mean likely to ride transit, but then you look at other minority populations, Black and African American, Asian, other race, Hispanic and Latino, more likely than the mean to ride transit. And what we always see is that people who don't own a car are the most likely socioeconomic group to ride transit of all. And then in Boston especially, immigrants have a higher chance, and people in poverty, not surprising. So when the darker green shades and the lighter green shades here are concentrations of people more likely to ride transit. Down in Boston proper, we're getting that kind of crescent shape that we heard about earlier this morning, Mattapan, Dorchester, Roxbury, and also up in Everett and Chelsea, and especially in Lynn too. Over the last 15 years or so, we've also seen a change in where transit-dependent populations are concentrated. So the green is an increase in these populations. So again, that kind of crescent shape down here. So that means that in general, people in these areas are, there's a higher concentration of minorities, people with no cars, immigrants, and people under the poverty level. And if we look at the growth in populations between 2000 and 2016, all of these population groups grew, and I think the total population grew by about 7% in the Boston region, but we're seeing major growth in certain populations, 72% growth among the Hispanic Latino population, and immigrants, a 35% growth. And also what we're seeing, I mentioned before that I was looking at transit ridership compared to the mean, is we have seen an increase in the amount of people riding transit between 2000 and 2016. So the Boston region has become more likely to use transit, and has in general had a makeup that is more likely to use transit based on these different socioeconomic characteristics. So something then that we can look at is, as I mentioned before, population density. Where are the people? Super important. Also, where are these concentrations of people? And so what we then can do is take this population density and weight it by those factors we showed before. So then we get a really interesting map that there are some areas before that down here, especially again in this crescent, especially in Everett and Chelsea, but especially in southern Boston, that may not be as dense as the core, may not be as dense as Kendall Square or Central, but because of the makeup of these neighborhoods, we're getting a better look at where are the people and where are the people that are more likely to be dependent on transit and use transit. We also, a really fundamental part of assessing the market is thinking about job accessibility. Job accessibility is a really, really good proxy for accessing destinations in general, because you're thinking, yes, people need to get to jobs, but anywhere where people are working in retail, at restaurants, at a barbershop, at a hospital, is also where people want to get to as a patron or a patient, or as someone who wants to enjoy these services. So as we can see in the Boston region, the distance as the crow flies does not determine job accessibility by transit. You know, Everett and Chelsea, just as the crow flies, are only 2 to 3 miles from downtown, but have less accessibility than we might expect considering how close they are. Especially down in southern Boston too, we see a lot less accessibility to jobs than we might expect. So then what we can do to really assess where the gaps in service are look at this adjusted population, which is looking at, again, the population density and the socioeconomic makeup of where are these people that are likely to ride transit and concentrations, and where are the areas with high or low job accessibility. And we can create a matrix that looks at these two against each other And the bright red is really where you have high concentrations of both population and transit-dependent persons with a low access to jobs. And so when you break those out and just keep the areas with low access, you really get a lot of information about where preliminarily should we really dive in and investigate why are there a lot of transit-dependent people here with low access to jobs and to other destinations. So again, really, really prominent is southern Boston, Dorchester, Mattapan, areas in Allston, Brighton along the B line, which if you ride the B line, I'm sure you know, limits how far you can get in this is based on a 45-minute transit commute. Everett and Chelsea, East Boston, parts of Somerville, and definitely in Lynn. So while this isn't, we can't really dive in and say exactly, you know, where can't these people access and, you know, exactly, you know, design a route based off of this map. This is really a good place to start. And for example, we know that in southern Boston, getting to the LMA, even though it's not that far away, is very, very difficult on transit. Other variables that we consider when thinking about transit-dependent populations is different shift times. So this map is showing the density of residents who work non-traditional hours where they leave to go to work between 4 p.m. and midnight. Currently, the MBTA is piloting some, you know, different late night, early service, but knowing where these populations live can help us better understand where this service might be most warranted. Other things to think about are disability, age, both young adults and older adults, and student needs. Moving forward, we also need to definitely consider major travel patterns. So we'll be working both with CDPS, which is the MPO in the region, and ODX data, which the T provides, to figure out where are current overall travel patterns and where are current transit travel patterns, and where can they be more matched up better. This is a map of New Orleans, but it's an example of what we're going to produce later on. And also what we're going to dive into is where are residents most likely to transfer more than once or have longer travel times than general, and how can we dive in and improve those people's experience on riding the MBTA. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Anna Gartsman and her entourage.
Thank you. First time with an entourage. Okay, hi, my name is Anna Gartsman. Am I speaking into this correctly? All right. I'm the Manager of Data Analytics in the Office of Performance Management and Innovation at the MBTA and MassDOT. I'm here to talk about the Rider Census, which is a system-wide passenger survey that we just finished collecting, and we released to the public in an unusual for us way. So I'd like to showcase that, talk a little bit about why we decided to do this. And then I've brought my entourage to present some of the research that's already been done with this and kind of to encourage more research in the future. So the system-wide passenger survey is a demographic survey. It is an FTA requirement, Federal Transit Agency Expectation. Yeah, oh, I should know. It is an FTA requirement to collect demographic data for large transit providers in order to conduct Title VI equity analyses. The reason to collect this information is because we know that transit riders are different from residents on their demographics, and so we can't just use data that's already being collected. We must collect our own data of our riders. I believe that this lists the data that we collect. Equity analyses are primarily done for minority status and low-income status, but we do collect a lot of other information. And in addition to collecting the demographic information, we collect the travel information so that we can associate your demographic information with the routes that you take. So the last time we did this was in 2008 and 2009, and then we began this project in 2015, and it ended in 2017. To get a statistically valid sample size, we need 2 years of data collection. And some of the routes that have low ridership, it's very difficult to get enough people. And we're going to use this data for L6 analysis, as I mentioned, and also in the service planning and in general analysis of ridership trends. This table shows what you would expect, in that our bus riders are more minority and more low income than our other services, and services like commuter rail and boat are less so. But there's a lot more data that we share than just this. So, data collection process was long. So we started with an online instrument to try to get as many people as possible through online means, and then supplemented with in-person for the routes that had low response rates. So we advertised in our vehicles and also in various other forms. So those were car cards, train cards, and then we had various languages covered as well, trying to get as many foreign language speakers as possible. And so we had riders report their most recent trip and their demographics so that we could associate the demographic with the routes that they take. We collected about 35,000 forms reporting on 56,000 unlinked trips. So if you take a trip with a transfer, we counted you as using both forms of transit. So we achieved a reasonable sample size at the station level for rapid transit and commuter rail and Silver Line, and then at the route level for buses. So this is what the form looked like if you participated in this effort. So basically we had people go through their entire trip. Where did they start, including the location, so their origin destination locations, how they paid, their entire trip, and then their demographic information at the end. So this was a lot for people to do, but as a result of this, we can build an interactive website with all of this data that you can download and view. So this is a preview of what it looks like. You can select any, this is showing the bus view, but you can also see that there is rapid transit and commuter rail. So on the bus view, you can select any route or any combination of routes. You can also select by municipality, and you can get a view of the demographic data of the people who use those services. You can also download this data for your own personal use. And if you select the route, this is kind of what it looks like. So I've selected the 111 here. It's cutting off a little bit. But it's basically showing you, in this case, the percent of people who use alternate modes and what alternate modes they use. As you can see, the 111 riders frequently take a different MBTA service. It's fun to know. So before we go into kind of how people are using this data, I want to talk a little bit about why we chose to release the data this way. So I think 3 reasons, from, let's say, most abstract to least abstract. The most abstract reason is for open data policy. So, and sort of the idea that we collected this data from people, it is using taxpayer dollars. It belongs to people. We should give it back, both to kind of share what we've collected, but also to encourage further participation, that this is important, that when you do that long survey, you're providing useful information that will be, that you can see and kind of see how you are represented here, but also will be used for decision making in the future. And then at a kind of less abstract level, the MBTA is a regional agency, and I think a lot of times people are very focused on their specific community, whether it be like the trains that they use and the service that they use, or the municipality in which they work. And so releasing all of the data at once in a kind of map view shows how far we go and kind of how you compare to the rest of the region. And then on a very unabstract level, if you use the data from 0809, which was released in a PDF, and you wanted to do some analysis, as I did, there was a lot of data entry, re-entry of the data that should have been available online. And so part of this goal is definitely to encourage research by people who are interested in this topic and can use data that's already processed and easily downloadable. and also reduce the data requests for me so that I don't have to respond. We released this data in a data challenge. We encouraged people to participate. People had about a month to submit their responses. Christoph couldn't be here, so I'm going to go through quickly what he did. And these are just examples of what you can do in a relatively short period of time with the data that is now available. So Christoph looked at what factors affect the percentage of MBTA riders who walk or bike in order to access or exit the transit service. So he looked at stations that had parking available, so not at bus service. And he did a spatial lag regression model, so accounting for spatial autocorrelation in nearby stations. And so he compared, or whatever, tried to predict the percent of people who arrive to MBTA stations by walking, by including the number of parking spaces available, the density nearby, the car ownership of the riders, and also other demographic characteristics, finding that when you control for the land use factors and car ownership, the other demographic characteristics are irrelevant to predicting walk and bike patterns. So that was cool. And then one of my entourage, Anna, compared, come on, yeah. I just was gonna talk while you come up. She compared our rider data to the US Census data.
So I just looked at minority ridership on all the buses. So that's non-Hispanic, everybody except non-Hispanic white. And my research focused on understanding if the number of minority riders on the bus is higher than the number of minority riders living near the route's bus stops. So that's looking at census data. So I did this by comparing these from our census with population data. And I found that on 86% of high ridership bus routes, the percent minority riding the bus was higher than the percent minority who live near the bus stops on the route. And on some buses, it was upwards of 3 times as many people riding the, 3 times as many people on the buses versus the census area around it. So I concluded that the census data near a bus stop is not a reliable metric for understanding the ridership on buses. And this is something that a lot of different transit agencies can probably use because often it's a lot easier just to use census data. So I think further research on this topic could look into at bus stop level specifically how different it is, because often you'll just look at around the bus stop to see what the demographic makeup is. So yeah.
Thank you. And Adriana is also here. Adriana looked at performance of bus routes compared to their minority and low-income status.
Hello. So, yeah, I looked at 2 sources of data. So I looked at the passenger survey and a document that the MBTA released in 2010 called the MBTA Route Performance Indicators, and that gave a bunch of measurements of performance. I focused on 2. The first one is cost per passenger. So it's basically like a subsidy, so it's how much it costs the MBTA to run the route past, per passenger, past the fares that the passenger pays. And there's a big range. I looked at just the bus route, so not the Silver Line. And the route with the lowest cost per passenger is, I think is 57 cents, and the highest is $9.76 cents. And what I did is that I plotted every bus route. You can see the blue and the purple graphs based on their fraction of low-income ridership and fraction of minority ridership versus their subsidization, or the cost per passenger. And as you can see, as the fraction of low-income ridership or the fraction of minority ridership increases, the subsidization of the cost per passenger goes down. So for reference, you can see this little one up here. This is a 351 bus from Express from Medford to Haymarket, costs $7.17 per passenger, has a 5% low-income population ridership. Down here, 17 bus runs from Fields Corner to Andrew and has 69% low-income ridership and costs only 71 cents per passenger. The second performance indicator I looked at was overcrowding. So MBTA gave every route either a pass or a fail. the failing routes are just the ones that are consistently overcrowded. And again, there is a relationship between minority and low-income ridership. The non-overcrowded routes, you can see, have 32% minority ridership and 26% low-income. Overcrowded routes have a significantly higher percent minority and low-income ridership. And yeah, so what I concluded from this was basically it's great for the MBTA to have cost-effective, low-cost routes, but the problem arises when the routes that the MBTA is kind of going out of its way to run, besides being pretty expensive, are almost exclusively high income and white. So actually, only 2 of the top 10 least cost-effective routes to run are not above average white and low income, and high income. Sorry. Yeah. So I think that this cost-effectiveness of these routes are a great way to advocate for better service. Maybe things like protected, like bus-only lanes, articulated buses, those kind of things, because of their low cost for the MBTA to run. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to move away from buses to Lyfts and Ubers and TNCs with Stephen Gehrke from MAPC.
Hands full here. Good morning, everyone. So I'm well caffeinated, so I should be able to hopefully get this in about 10 minutes or so we have a little time for a discussion afterwards. But yeah, as Al said, I'm Steve Gehrke. I'm a senior research analyst at MAPC, and check our jobs board because we're hiring. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ride-hailing in the Boston metro region, and specifically honing in on identifying the impacts to lower-income households in underserved areas. And this is part of a report that we released back in February, if you guys are not aware of that. But you are probably aware that Uber and Lyft have recently and dramatically sort of shifted the way that we travel throughout our regions. And they've done it rather quickly. In fact, in Massachusetts, Uber started service just only in 2011 and Lyft in 2013, so in less than a decade, they really had this dramatic impact in the ways that we're moving around. As part of a panel back at TRB this past January, and Bruce Shaler, who does some of this research on New York City, said that ride-hailing and cab services will likely exceed local bus ridership by the end of this year, according to one prediction, which is just an astonishing revelation of something that's only been around for less than a decade. And so, unlike New York City, a lot of public agencies and places don't have good reporting of these data. These are private entities that want to preserve their information and their business models, so they're not willing necessarily to share it with public agencies. However, without these data, it's really difficult for us to provide any sort of meaningful impact or any sort of evidence-based policies. And some of the policies at MAPC that we want to understand is how does this impact regional travel demand modeling, and then other forecasting methods so that we can look forward as to what are the predictors of their use, why are people using these and what are the reasons for doing such, and then ultimately can we predict this growth and adoption as we go forward. Hold it a little closer. So the research context that we had for this study, we looked at 2 things. We wanted to be able to provide a little more specification to these forecasting methods, and so we wanted to describe regional ride-hailing passengers and their trips, and then also look at this question of substitution. So a lot of times you'll hear that Uber and Lyft may say that, well, these are complementing transit services, when in fact they may be competing, but just to kind of unravel that sort of decision a little bit more. And then additional questions of interest to MAPC and kind of in line with the work here being done in the BARI Institute today is that do ride-hailing services provide a viable mobility option to areas that are currently underserved by rapid transit? And then also, is this new shared mobility option exacerbating or is it improving economic inequities? And so talk a little bit about the data that we analyzed for this study, and then I'll provide some descriptive statistics of it. But back in the fall, we recruited 10 drivers, and the majority of them were from within the Boston region, but we actually had a driver that's from Nashua, New Hampshire, and would come down and drive around individuals, and I don't think that's an uncommon anecdote that you hear, is that you have a lot of drivers coming into the area and taking passengers throughout. We fitted these 10 drivers that we recruited and trained with a survey instrument that was placed on a tablet that they would give to the passengers, and the passengers would then provide a little information about their socioeconomic background, what's their general travel patterns on a day or monthly basis, and then understand a little bit more about the specific ride-hailing trip that they're being picked up on, so we can get at some of those trip purposes and stuff like that. We collected 944, so nearly 1,000 responses that were usable over a 4-week period, and this concluded just before the Thanksgiving holiday, so sort of in an area a time span that's kind of normal travel behaviors, we would like to believe. And so now I'll kind of go through sort of some of these findings from this work and just descriptively. I think this graphic looks at the respondent age of our survey, and it's surprising, it's not surprising. I think a lot of us can attest or think that, everyone who's using these services are young. However, I think we were taken back that over 4/5 of the respondents of this survey were individuals who we would kind of term millennials, so born since 1983, and that's definitely not representative of the MAPC region, right? And so you can start to think of individuals who are young, and if they're using these services, they're really going to be forming habits, and this is going to be a new shared mobility option that's just not going to go away. It's going to kind of proliferate as we go forward. Looking at household income, however, we were surprised and kind of relieved to find that it was somewhat representative of the MAPC region. And so 26%, about a quarter of our passengers reported an annual household income below $38,000. And so immediately you're thinking, well, these are all students, right? They're younger folks who earn a low income. That wasn't the case. 57% of the respondents within that lowest income bracket reported either having a part or full-time employment. So moving on from the sort of socioeconomic backgrounds to looking at the frequency of travel, 2/3 of these passengers state that they use ride-hailing services on a weekly basis, so at least one time per week. So this is really getting at this habit formation. So individuals are using these services repeatedly and probably will continue to do so going forward. Okay, and then we did get a little bit of information to look at it spatially. We asked individuals to provide their home location zip code, and so we could look at trips that originate from the home location or trips that kind of end at the home location to kind of get the general distribution in the area. And it's going to be pretty hard to make out, but we overlay this map with the rapid transit services, and you can start to see, let's see, kind of out here in Waltham, over here in Brighton, kind of in the Inman areas, and then kind of down in southern portions of Boston, you start to see, individuals are using these services areas where you don't really have high rapid transit service. As far as home as a destination, individuals were more often to use this in our sample. So individuals are taking at the end of their day, going back home and using these services. And again, you see these same sort of areas pop out, the Alston-Brighton area, you see Cambridgeport. But then you see these areas kind of off the end of the sort of rapid transit line, so it's going to be some wait time to get out back home, and it's going to take you a long time to go back there, and so you're kind of using these new mobility options to perhaps supplant that trip. Looking at the cost, so a little bit more about the context, just under half of ride-hailing passengers took a trip that was under $10, and so a $10 Uber Lyft trip isn't going to take you very far, it's just a couple miles, so these are really short trips that individuals are using these services for. And I think this was one of the headlines from our report, was we looked at this question of mode substitution. So we asked individuals, if you didn't have Uber or Lyft available to you for this particular trip, what mode would you have selected? And 42% of respondents said that it was public transit. And so it's either a bus or rail that individuals would have chose. Another 12% said they would have used some sort of active mode of transport, walking or biking. And then other individuals wouldn't have traveled at all. So there's unlocking this sort of latent demand for travel. And you sum that all together, and those are all trips that would not have been motorized vehicles that are now becoming motorized vehicles, and oftentimes these trips are occurring during our most congested period, so you're adding additional capacity to a system that's already at capacity. Okay, so then there were two major themes that we kind of highlighted in the report. I'm going to go over just one of them here for sake of time, was looking at this idea of competitive choices. And so we looked at individuals who already have a transit pass, so then taking the T or taking any MBTA service would have effectively been no additional cost to them. And then they decided that they were going to take for their particular trip Uber or Lyft, so they substitute that trip. And you can kind of see, or you can plainly see, that sort of for this lowest income cohort, the individuals with the transit pass were adopting these services for shorter, lower cost trips than an individual for higher income households. So perhaps it's supplanting sort of local bus trips that are just kind of, it's really convenient, it's really reliable, and perhaps they're using these services with all the caveats of our sample and such. But this is sort of one finding that we have within our study. And so then I'll just touch on a quick couple conclusions from this just to reiterate the points that I've already made. So the demographics are suggesting that there's this quick adoption rate that's happening. Individuals are using these new mobility options often and frequently, and they're younger individuals, so there is this idea of habit formation that may come through, that as we continue through the life course, individuals are going to be really locked into using these new mobility options. Substitution, I didn't show the slide, but it's happening during these peak period travel So the morning commute, the evening commute, sort of worsening our regional roadways during these already congested times. And then sort of the additional points there of individuals in lower income households. The results of the survey, although we didn't ask about reliability and such, it was sort of getting at this idea that ride hailing is a viable alternative option to using transit services. And then also individuals without nearby transit service are adopting these services for travel to and from the home location. So ideally we would like to have had a little more spatial specificity to what we were asking in there, but we did have some points that we could highlight within our research. Some policy implications, so just touch on two of them real quickly that we outlined in the report, but we believe that there should be adjustments made to increase the legislative mandated ride assessment of this. So currently, Uber and Lyft just have to pay 20 cents per ride, and 10% of this goes to the municipality in which the trip originates. So this is just a dime every trip it's going to, and we know that the burden of these additional services is much greater than that. In our report, we estimated that MBTA in a pretty conservative assumptions was losing perhaps 35 cents per ride-hailing trip. And so we need to really raise this assessment fee so we cover those costs and other costs as is provided to our transit network. And then finally, it's great as a researcher to kind of do studies like this, but it'd be a lot more representative and just easier for us if there's some greater provisions and protocols for data sharing agreements, right? And so we don't have to do all these sort of back-end ways of collecting this information if we have these private entities provide the information for us. The Department of Public Utility is currently collecting information annually, and I think we've heard in the next week or two there'll be some results that'll be shared on that. But they'll only be at the municipal level, so it's a very aggregate picture that it's depicting, and a lot of these policies we need something that's a little more finer and disaggregate to make sort of the right implications for operations and kind of a greater understanding. So with that, there's the link to the report. I'd like to acknowledge Allison Felix and Tim Reardon, who are also co-authors on the report, and additional contributors, Jesse Partridge-Guerrero over there in the back, and Eric Barassa, our Director of Transportation. Thank you.
Thank you. And if all the speakers could come sit behind a microphone. I felt that coming. Sorry about that. Okay, so we've got about 18 minutes left, and I just want to help, for those of you who are visual, I think you're all pretty familiar with Boston, but if we sort of link through what we heard about today, we started with the idea that we're going to do transit-oriented development in places where the market isn't providing it, but it makes sense to provide it to people, to communities where it might be hard to invest because of underinvestment over many years. And the two places, just to go back geographically to where they were, one is just south of Dudley Square, where you have a lot of bus options. And if you're willing to walk a little ways, you can get to the Orange Line. The other one was at the end near Ashmont Station. So they're both providing people with a lot of transit options if you can then become part of that new targeted community. So if you are a person of color or a low-income person who is living in this neighborhood, you can then access this new housing opportunity, mixed use, in your neighborhood. And then because it's mixed use, there are other amenities available to everyone in the neighborhood, again, in this transit-rich place. Looking at our bus ridership, it sounds like we saw that crescent shape that we also was highlighted by the Commissioner of Public Health this morning, the idea that there are parts of Boston where a lot of people rely on bus service, and then thank you, you went beyond Boston and you said Chelsea, Everett, and Lynn, which are also places that just really want better transit options. For those of you who aren't aware, though most of you probably are, Chelsea got a new Silver Line last Saturday, so I'll be curious to see how that impacts the data, although I think the most vocal advocates in Chelsea would say that they're still the lowest income population is still relying on the 111 and the 116 and the 117, and those aren't getting bus lanes yet. Anna's research and the research of our college students here, or university students, really highlighted how there is demand by some of our lowest income residents in Greater Boston to take the bus. They're taking these buses that are very crowded, that have a really low cost per passenger, and that are disproportionately reflecting the census tracts that they're going through. And then there's this question of, okay, maybe I'm a person who has just enough money that I need to get to this place I want to go, and I have the choice of crowded bus that may or may not take me to my destination. I might not live in one of these great new TOD places, and so my alternative is Lyft and Uber. And how can we help the T provide better service if we're not taking maybe more fees along the way or trying to change the equation for people? So is that a good summary of this is connecting it all together? And so I guess some of you alluded to it, but are there any places where you think, based on your research and hearing from other people, what kinds of policies or programs or new infrastructure would make you really excited on building off of either your research or the things your research uncovered you wish you could get this other thing would happen to make life better?
All right, everyone's looking at each other, so I'm going to jump in. Two things I would highlight. One, I don't know if anybody here attended the MassInc event on Tuesday, the release of the new study on transit-oriented development in gateway cities. Really interesting research looking at sort of transportation, land use, real estate investment, transit investment, I think raising some important questions about really regional equity beyond the urban core. And as someone who commuted down from Lawrence today, it is not easy. And I love my city and my neighborhood. It's a great, increasingly less affordable place than it used to be. But we have a lot of communities that are technically served by rail, but really have very limited service options and don't connect to most of the region's jobs. Commuter rail is not going to fix all of that. Regional bus service is a hugely important part of that. But I think broadening the scope of the discussion to make sure that we're picking up regional centers, certainly including Lynn, Everett, Chelsea, Fall River, New Bedford, Brockton. We have a lot of communities outside the core that really are part of our regional economy. So appreciate the work that MassInc and the team there did, and hope that we can make sure those places are part of the conversation. Also, to clarify, I did highlight 2 projects that we invested in Boston, but we do have a project in Chelsea, actually right next to the new Silver Line station that's opening. And we're looking at several projects further out. We have another one on the South Shore. So, but it's been more challenging for a variety of reasons to make those ones work.
Anyone else? Policies or projects that excite you or can address some of the issues you raised?
I just think I alluded to it, kind of the aggregate reporting of the use of Uber and Lyft. And so I think we're struggling in trying to find information that's more on the routes of these drivers and such, so we can see specifically like what areas are they serving, or so what are the type of riders going on there. And then tying that to the revenue and non-revenue, so you have these vehicles that are driving around searching for rides, and what's the greenhouse gas implications of that and emissions, sort of, and tying that kind of public health angle into some of our work as well.
Yeah, I think there is ongoing research to kind of continue the idea of like what MBTA trips are being lost to the rideshare community, like how many of them are things that should have been done in the car already, and maybe people didn't have access to taxi service. So if you're in the Crescent and taxis didn't used to go to you, now you might have that. So some of the trips we expect to lose and should lose, but some of them are sort of trips where we could become more competitive by adding a bus lane or additional service, and any research in that area too, especially around areas where a lot of the travel is being done on buses or sort of like in a corridor. So for example, the Forest Hills, Rosendale, Washington Street corridor is frequently cited as so many people make the trip on that corridor in a bus as opposed to a car. Shouldn't they have a bus lane? And how many of those people are now instead, while they don't have one, would choose a TNC trip instead along that same corridor, adding to the car congestion that's already in there. So there's additional work, and I'm really excited that that's happening.
Yeah, definitely reiterate having public access to Uber and Lyft data would be incredible.
Nice, yes.
Also, something that I am not aware that's being done, but still something that's always of interest to me is, this morning it was mentioned that there's still, a large gender pay gap in Massachusetts, and I'm always really interested in the way that transportation affects that because different populations have different amount of time to spend on traveling, and generally lower income minority women end up having to spend the most time traveling to jobs of anyone, and then are still responsible for the majority of the housework, things like that, and how that
implications on what's known as like time poverty. I would always love to have opportunities to study gender, because I think it's a socioeconomic variable that's often missing in the transportation discussion.
It's a great insight. Do any of you guys have personal narratives that came out of any of your work, or even anecdotally, how these transportation options or these new housing options are affecting the lives of individuals? You all presented data in aggregate that was fascinating. I'm just curious if any of you had that. It's okay if you don't.
Well, I personally know the 2% of ferry riders that are minority, if that counts.
I think I know them too.
Yep.
I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. Catherine.
You asked about anecdotes, so I have 2 anecdotes.
I think there's a mic at the back too.
The first anecdote is that my neighbor quit his minimum wage job in order to be an Uber driver. So there's the other side of the equation, which is the economic opportunity, right, is part of the conversation with Airbnb as well. I have a perspective on it, but I think it's also part of the discussion. And then the second is the family daycare where I send my youngest son. The husband is a taxi driver and owns a medallion and lost a huge amount of family wealth. So there's the benefit of job flexibility and income, and then there are the other people who, they're both immigrants, by the way, my neighbor and my family daycare, and they lost a massive amount of their savings that was really invested in a taxi medallion. And then, my family daycare also employs some wonderful women who live and work in, who live in Boston, and in order to get to the Forest Hill T station, will actually call an Uber at the end of the day, working probably a minimum wage job, looking after children, and has even been called out to say, my husband drives a taxi, and you're still calling an Uber. And they say, yeah, because there's even a bus stop right in front of the house, and that actually, when you think about time poverty, people make trade-offs, right? And so those are 2 stories to me that sort of highlight the conflict in the economic realities and the sort of the consequences, good and bad, for people, and sort of the flexibility it affords either the person who's doing it for employment and the person who's doing it to make up for lost time in her day. But the last thing I want to ask you guys is, in the Uber conversation, I don't even see cognitive dissonance. Like, I don't even see any acknowledgement of the environmental consequences of the decisions that we make. And I want to sort of come back to that, because I feel like that hasn't, that's an important topic to touch on in this debate about sort of what transportation options we choose, where we invest in housing, but also the fact that sort of you didn't touch on at the end, education, and that there's sort of consequences to these choices, and that there really is a lack of understanding or acknowledgement of the environmental consequences of the people who choose to either use ride-hailing or provide ride-hailing as a service. And so I just want to pose that question to the group of, do we all have an obligation, does the state have an obligation, do other planning agencies have an obligation to make education of the consequences of these decisions and the trade-offs of these decisions a bigger part of the dialogue?
Yeah, so I think there is some sort of conspicuous consumption going on when individuals are using these Uber and Lyft rides often, and it's not much thought given to what are the greater consequences of that, to talk about that last point. And so I don't know the ins and outs of exactly where this 20 cents that goes right now that's legislatively mandated to provide, but some 5% of that does go towards the taxi industry. I think that sunsets in 2022, but there's some education component within there. I don't know what that particular language is within there, what those education programs are for the driver themselves. So that's just one point in regards to that. The environmental consequences, are great. It's something that at MAPC we're trying to get our hands on some information to kind of get a little bit more at those, because the drivers are, not making much money, and I think there was an MIT study that came out that had some controversy that was refuted, but it was showing that, I think it was a third of drivers who are doing Uber and Lyft services earn below poverty levels or lower income levels, and so, it's a tough choice that these families are making to do this driving, but it's just not making them a lot of money right now, and so I think that's a difficult decision, and so some education as to how much you're earning and the cost of that, and then obviously the taxi medallion, these industries are cutting right into that sort of upfront investment that they put within their vehicle to purchase this and such like that. So.
Can you pull the mic closer to you?
Sure.
Just for when you pull each other.
Just to add to that, my colleague Rafael Maras at CLF has been doing a lot of work on this and trying to think through the state policy implications in Massachusetts around not so much Uber and Lyft per se, but sort of the intersection of ride-hailing with autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles. So, you know, the environmental trade-offs for sure under the current, you know, kind of profile of what we have on the road today are pretty dire. I mean, you know, the numbers you were showing are, I think, a little scary in terms of both emissions, but also, frankly, just the amount of time we are going to spend on the road with that much more congestion. But there are so many forces at play that are really reshaping the way we move around in pretty rapid sort of succession, and so I think it is a great question to be asking. I think everyone will make the choice that's cheapest and most convenient all the time, because that's sort of the way we live. But if we don't understand what some of those other trade-offs are and bake that into policy, I think we're missing a big sort of fork in the road.
Any other audience questions for this group? Yes.
This is a transportation data policy question. So I know it's so difficult to get data about Uber and Lyft, which are profit sector companies. Profit sector is okay, but one could argue if they're committed to operate in a particular area, they should be providing data anonymized, aggregated to some degree, so there's no, they're not giving away the store. Is there any advocacy in this area or thought of advocacy in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think Raphael is doing some of that work at CLF and stuff. So I think we are in our report we state for this. You know, I don't think we have a lot of we can't actually move the legislation, but we can kind of advocate for, you know, better reporting of these data and allowing us to have something more than just a municipal level reporting of how many trips, you know, start in Cambridge. I mean, I don't think we can really plan a lot around that. So I think pushing for those, like, more, it still has to be anonymized and stuff like that, but sort of more route level information or more information that allows us to kind of understand who the users of these services are, I think are needed. And I think we're pushing for that. I think all in San Francisco, they're pushing for that. I think all across the nation, our urban areas are pushing for this information to be released.
Lots of hands. We'll go to the back here.
So I have a follow-up question to that. Has there ever been any sort of idea or public appeal for drivers to voluntarily submit their trip ride history from the past 6 months and have it analyzed that way? I know that it's very complicated and would require a lot of data security issues, personal security issues. But I mean, I'd be fascinated to look at my own ride history from the past 6 months. I'm kind of terrified to know how much it cost me. So is there been that angle of like,
Yeah, I think we're looking at that. I mean, as researchers, we don't want to tip our hat too much as to what we're looking into doing. But Uber and Lyft have, over time, made that much more difficult to even get that information. So it's essentially, a driver can't just upload a CSV that has all the information about where they picked up individuals at and where they drove to any longer. It's really like screen by screen, you feel trip by trip. And so that'd be very labor intensive to have an individual come in and to a driver to do that, each screenshot of every single trip that they did throughout that. And so it's increasingly difficult to get your hands on that sort of information through those sort of avenues. But yeah, it's something that I think folks are looking into. Yeah.
I just want to jump in too. And, you know, the contrast between these two things. We're mad at Uber and Lyft. They won't share data. I've been on those phone calls. The answer is no, they won't share them. Part of their money strategy is literally around, like, they're gaining value from that data, and that's part of why they don't want to share it. But you think about the work that Anna did. You know, she spent 18 months trying to get enough people to talk about their demographics on a bus to have statistically rigorous data. Transportation data is so hard to collect. Like, we look out there and we're like, couldn't we just count them all? And I mean, literally, you can watch the highway go below you. We could just be counting them. But other than, like, you can figure out how many people are crossing a line on different modes. We've figured out the technology for that. But where they're starting and ending is still this really black box thing. So for all the data out there that we seem to have, like, this is cutting edge data, and it's hard to collect what you guys brought to this today. So just as a reflection. I'm looking around at my time person. Can I get one more question? Yes.
I have just a quick question about
That is correct.
We do have much more in-depth detail on those trips that we don't get.
Okay, so next year at this conference, we'll see that.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually, there's a data blog post on our data blog about sort of some of the work we're doing with that pilot and that data that we get pulled from.
For those of you who don't know, there are 3 people in this room that I just want to call out. Laurel, who just answered that question in purple, is Anna's boss and a great resource. You can follow the data blog and follow along with that. Tim Reardon, who you heard from earlier at MAPC, is in the back. And then Nigel's counterpart, the other co-chair of the New Urban Mechanics, is Chris Carter, who's sitting here in a wave. So they're all people who can also answer some of these questions and are, Tim's face it, Laurel's answer, like big excitement. So they're all here in this room. If you are following along on Twitter, the hashtag for today's conference is Boston Data. And if you want to give a shout out to MAPC or CLF or Nelson Nygaard or the MBTA, they would all be really excited if you did that, I'm sure. I want to thank you all for being in the room today. Again, feel free to talk to any of our panelists. And thank you guys for putting together these really rich presentations. I really appreciate it.